Hello, good day to you. I just wanted to make a really quick video. Some people have been emailing me some questions about speech too, and I know those are due already tomorrow night. I pushed them back a day because I didn't have the schedule right, and I thought that was only fair. And so this isn't, I know you're already fully working on them, and this isn't meant to make you redo them or rewrite them in any way, but just to kind of help you as you go and maybe provide you just a little bit of comfort. So the big thing about speech too, and I've talked about this in a couple of videos, and of course it's on the assignment description sheet, is that it focuses in on a policy. Now, the reason that I focus in on policy um, is couple-fold. One, if you go back to the persuasion videos, right, and we talk about how belief is really, really difficult, values are really, really difficult to persuade, if we don't focus in on policy, a lot of times what happens is that's where people go, is they go to value or belief. Well, policy is action. And that's how reality is made in our world, right? Is through policy. I just defended my dissertation, which was really cool. And my topic surrounds sexual violence. Well, so we know that there are a bunch of sexual violence laws. In fact, I wrote a whole chapter on sexual violence laws in our country. But what you may not know is that most of those sexual violence laws, or they were called rape laws at the time, didn't really come into play until the 1970s. So before the 1970s, and depending on which culture you're historically in, some cultures did have different types of laws that negotiated sexual behavior, but I mean, for the most part, rape didn't really exist because we didn't have laws that criminalized it, right? And it wasn't until we sort of wrote that down and said, this is against the law that became reality. So do you see how policy, in many ways, dictates our reality? Another good example is how in the U.S. Alcohol is legal. We tried to make it illegal. It didn't work. That's where we get prohibition. But marijuana is not. And marijuana has this whole history. If you've done any kind of study about marijuana, scientifically, and this is not me advocating for marijuana, but scientifically, marijuana has a lot less impact physically, and it's a lot less dangerous in terms of like you can't really die from it, whereas you can die from alcohol poisoning. You can't really overdose on it, whereas you can overdose on alcohol. It there are some health benefits, right? We've seen like CBD oil or medicinal marijuana. There's no such thing as medicinal alcohol. No one's going to prescribe to you tequila. Do you see what I'm saying? And yet, alcohol, which is more, argue like less healthy, more dangerous, is legal, whereas marijuana is not. And you can kind of follow the history of our country, right, where we've always made a lot of money on alcohol, whereas traditionally marijuana has come from somewhere else. And now we're seeing the legalization of marijuana, and we're seeing how then we have capitalized on making money on that. And so, again, how those policies really dictate reality. So going back to your speech, right? So whatever community concern you set up in the first speech, now you're trying to find, okay, what kind of policies dictate reality about this community concern? For some of you, that'll be very easy, right? A few of you talked about red lines, and I mean, those are policies within themselves, so you just go right to those policies. Or maybe you find policies that currently, are impactful about race segregation in Milwaukee. Some people may have a topic that they find more difficult to attach to a policy. So I had a student one time, his first speech was all about I think it was vitamin D deficiency, specifically in men. And at the time, they were really debating the Affordable Care Act in Congress. And so he kind of talked about that. And afterwards, I asked him, like, why didn't you just talk about the Affordable Care Act? Like, clearly you wanted to talk about that. And he's like, well, I didn't know if it was too far away from my original topic. And I was like, well, one, don't make it harder, right? If you find a policy that's away from your original topic, I mean, the reason I link them, right, and go back and watch that speech description video if you're confused, but the reason I link the speeches is so that you don't have to start over on research, right? So that you can really build discussion and research and you know, use your sources in different ways and explore different frameworks around similar topics. But if you find something, you know, that you're really passionate about, don't be afraid to explore it. And if you can make a link then, which I think he could have, right, to talk about vitamin D deficiency and then, you know, just healthcare in general in our country, that would have linked really nicely to the Affordable Care Act and how that was being debated. So speech 2 has two components. You're going to find a policy that deals with your community concern, and you are still going to give a lot of information about that policy. The reason I make you do that is because people do not realize how much information is involved in good persuasion. When they try to do persuasion, they just start giving their opinion, which I have a whole rant about. I just, right, like opinions don't super exist to me. They don't make any sense. It's not about your opinion, as that article said. It's about what you can argue, right? And so if you're just telling me things you think and feel, like, that's not persuasive. I don't care. Whereas giving me a lot of information and then putting it in an argument or a persuasive framework, that is going to be convincing. So I want you to give a bunch of information about the policy. How was it made? Who made it? Why was it made? How was it designed? Who passed it? Were there critics? Like, really dig in and then be able to give a stance, right? Now remember, you can't persuade the status quo. So your stance can't be, this is a good policy. Bye. I have heard a lot of speeches on same-sex marriage. And then in 2015, they stopped. Do you know why they stopped? Because we legalized it. After we legalized it, there was no need for speeches about it because it was status quo. It was real. Now, I have heard speeches since about same-sex adoption, about rights, about marriages not being recognized. Like, I've heard a lot of things still, but it's things that are problematic. So you need to find something. Now, maybe the policy is great, and then your stance is that this should be adopted in more places, right? Or maybe your stance is that the policy is great, but it's not being enforced, right? And when I'm saying the policy is great, what I really mean is the policy is effective, right? So you can structure your speech. Usually it lays out in one of two ways. You can kind of split it and do the first half informative on the policy, and then kind of take a stance and say, now I'm going to talk about, you know, my stance on this policy. Or you can start that in the beginning to say, and start it very persuasively to say, you know, there's this policy, it's usually problematic, or there's this policy that's not being passed that we need to have that needs to be passed. You know, that starts very persuasively. You start with your stance, but then you need a really big point, you know, like your first main body point that really dives into the info around the policy. Does it make sense? The reason I want you to have info about the policy is because the more info you have, the easier it is to be persuasive. So I'm trying to teach you how those two connect. Does that make sense? So nothing new in this video, but hopefully me kind of talking about it will help you take what you already have. You've probably got a really good start, and hopefully now you can kind of flesh that out. Also remember, and I'll put this in the email, the GoReact account is yours, so you can use it however you want. And what I mean by that is feel free to record practices on it. If you want to record practices, just do it on your own account and then not in the official assignment place. That should be very easy to do. So feel free to use it to practice on and record yourself if you want. Totally yours to do so. Okay, I hope you have a beautiful day, and email me if you have any questions.